Hi, my name is Leo Yamashita. I'm a graduating senior majoring in psychology and biology. I've been working on researching honeybees with Dr. Couvillon for the past year, and this presentation is about oddity discrimination of visual categories by honeybees. So why do we study the learning in honeybees? Well, learning in honeybees is surprisingly similar to vertebrates like dogs, cats, and us humans. This despite the fact that the brain of a honeybee is very different from the brain of a vertebrate. The two have very different structures and they honestly look completely different. Um, However, we still have the same underlying principles of neurological functions, like how our brain cells talk to each other. And the image on the right is a picture of a bee's brain. And as you can see, it doesn't look anything like ours, and they have evolved separately from us a very long time ago. This phylogenetic tree shows the relationships between several types of organisms. Invertebrates, like honeybees, are on the right, while vertebrates, like us, are on the left. And this split happened about 500 million years ago, which is a really long time ago if you think about it. And since this split happened such a long time ago, it's pretty amazing to see that the learning between the two essentially parallel each other. We're interested in complex learning in honeybees, and the main question is, can you learn relationships? The left diagram is an example of basic discrimination. Let's say that the orange stimulus gets rewarded and the split stimulus gets punished. It counts as basic discrimination because no matter how I switch the positioning of the two, the orange stimulus will always get rewarded. It's easier to think, oh, orange equals reward than the oddity discrimination on the right. In an oddity discrimination test, 3 stimuli are presented. From the top 3 stimuli on the right, only the odd stimulus is rewarded. In this case, it's orange. However, on the bottom, the split green-yellow stimulus is rewarded. This is oddity discrimination, and it's an example of relational learning. Instead of thinking, oh, this color is rewarded, the bee must compare the 3 stimuli and recognize that one of them is odd. This recognition and learning is relatively simple to us adults. I'm pretty sure that you won't have that much trouble figuring out which one is the odd one. However, children under the age of 4 have difficulty solving this problem, and our research question investigates whether honeybees can solve this difficult problem or not. We conduct experiments using free-flying honeybees. This means that they're not contained within the laboratory and they're free to fly around and roam. The use of free-flying honeybees can be called the free-flying method, and it involves several steps, and I'll be going over the method for working with honeybees. The free-flying method allows us to collect and work with honeybees for experimentation. So the image shown here is where I collect all my bees. The white boxes within the cage is where all the hives are located, and this whole general area is located behind the lab where I work at. The little structure in the foreground is a feeder where forager bees gather. So this is a close-up of the feeder I just talked about, and the feeder contains a jar of 15% sugar water. And this is an easy way of collecting forager bees that are looking for nectar or sugar. And we pick up one bee at a time in a matchbox, and that means we only do work with one bee at a time per experiment. After we pick up a bee, I'll bring them up to the lab training window. This is the training window where the experiment takes place. The window is open to the outside so the bees can come and leave as they please. The hives and feeders that we just saw are located right below this window, and inside the training window there's a stimulus that has a target, and it has a drop of sugar water in it, and it serves as our artificial flower. And we need to put the bee on this target that was in our matchbox. We'll take a matchbox containing a bee and we'll place it on a pre-training stimulus that has a drop of 50% sucrose on it. That is 50 compared to the 15% 15 that was on the feeder. To place the bee, I'll open the matchbox very slightly so the bee's proboscis or tongue can stick out. The bee will be attracted to the light, and then the bee's proboscis will touch the drop and it'll proceed to drink. I can then slowly let the bee out of the matchbox while it is drinking, and it'll feed for about a minute, and during this time I need to mark the bee. So the reason why I need to mark the bee is because I need to make sure that I'm working consistently with one bee, and I'm not working with like a stranger bee that could potentially come in at a random time. I need to make sure that I'm working with one bee consistently over the course of the experiment. So while the bee is distracted with the sugar water, I'll place a little bit of nail polish on the abdomen of the honeybee. This doesn't really disturb the bee, and it'll keep drinking until it's full. So when the bee finishes drinking, it'll lift up, it'll return to the hive, and it'll unload the sugar water to a younger bee that will begin the honey making process. And now at this point, the marked bee has 2 choices. One, it can go back to the feeder where we originally found it, or it can come back to the window. Now remember that the feeders have a sugar water concentration of 15%, 1-5, while the drop at the window has a 50% drop. This 50% is very, very, very high, and no flower in the wild will ever have nectar concentrations or sugar water concentrations as high as 50%. This serves as a motivator for the bee to come back to the training window. And when the bee does come back to the training window, training can begin. And again, the mark lets us know that we're working with one bee consistently over the course of the experiment. This is an example of a training trial for experiment 1, oddity discrimination of 2 categories. The bee will come back to 3 stimuli with 2 types of categories. The 2 categories are the split stimuli and the pinwheel pattern stimuli. The odd category in this example is split, and it'll have a drop of 50% sucrose on it. The 2 non-odd categories, or the 2 pinwheel pattern ones, will have a drop of stevia on it. Stevia serves as a punishment. It is a natural 0-calorie sweetener used as a sugar alternative, and it does not taste good to the honeybees. It serves as a highly aversive stimuli. Now, if the bee lands on the odd category, then I'll record it as correct. The bee will drink until it is full, and it will return to the hive, unload, and it'll come back for a second trial. If the bee lands on a non-odd category, it will fly off the target, and it will choose another target until it correctly chooses the odd category. I'll record this as incorrect, and the bee will return to the hive. After returning to the hive, it will unload, and it'll come back for the next trial. Here's a sample trial sequence for experiment 1. There were 15 total trials per bee. Every trial set was unique. There's only 1 odd stimulus per trial, and there will always be 3 stimuli. For example, the odd one in the first trial is a split category on the left. The odd one in trial 2 is the pinwheel category on the right. The positioning of the odd category, so whether it's in the left, middle, or right position, were balanced across all 15 trials. Whether the odd stimulus was a pinwheel or a split category was also balanced across the 15 trials. For experiment 1, I trained 8 bees individually. Training session lasted about 2 to 4 hours per bee. There were 15 total trials and 3 stimuli per trial. The choice of odd was rewarded with 50% sucrose, while the choice of non-odd was punished with stevia. The first choice was recorded. If the choice was odd, then I scored it as correct. If the choice was non-odd, then I scored it as incorrect. Now, if the bee chose incorrectly, remember that the bee can keep choosing until it finds sucrose on the odd target. After drinking the sucrose, the bee will return to the hive to unload and returns to the window within 3 to 5 minutes for the next trial. And I repeated this process until all 15 trials were completed. After all 8 bees were finished, I looked at the correct first choice for all the bees across 15 trials. The result of experiment 1 is shown here. The x-axis shows the 15 trials of training. The y-axis shows the proportion of bees that chose correctly on each trial. For example, for trial 1, 25% of the bees, or 2 out of the 8 bees, chose the correct odd category on their very first landing. The chance line is drawn at 0.33 or 33%. This is because there are 3 stimuli per trial, and the chance of picking the odd one just by chance or randomly is 1 in 3. If bees could not solve the problem, then we can expect the points on the graph to be below 0.33. Now, the problem does look difficult, but it appears that the bees were able to solve the problem over time. And we noticed because the proportion of bees that chose correctly peaked at 75% at trial 9, and by trial 12 it stabilized at 60%. These numbers are significantly higher than chance, meaning that the bees really did figure out which one was the odd category. Now, it should be noted that it's very unlikely to reach 100% since this problem is very difficult to the bees. Other animals rarely will reach 100% unless you do countless amount of training with them. This oddity discrimination of 2 categories was difficult, but we can increase the difficulty of this problem by introducing a 3rd category, which I will describe in the next following slides. Experiment 1 focused on 2 categories, a split target and a pinwheel pattern target. By introducing a solid target, we can add a 3rd category and we can crank up the difficulty of this problem. The 2 images on the right are an example using a solid category. By adding this 3rd solid category, we can create a much more difficult experiment, as there are many more combinations possible between the 3 types of categories. This is a sample trial sequence for experiment 2. Now the split, pinwheel, and solid categories can be odd, and this is because we introduced the third category, the solid category, to the two pre-existing categories. Now there are 6 kinds of trial types as opposed to the 2 types in experiment 1, making this experiment a lot harder. In experiment 1, there were 2 types of trials with 2 categories. The pinwheel could be odd with the split being non-odd, and vice versa. However, in experiment 2, there are 6 types of trials with 3 categories. The split non-odds can be paired with pinwheel and solid odds. The solid non-odds can be paired with split and pinwheel odds. And finally, the pinwheel non-odds can be paired with split and solid odds. This increased level of complexity leads to the hypothesis that the second experiment is much harder than the first experiment. The methods and procedure for experiment 2 is exactly the same as experiment 1, except this time I trained 9 bees instead of 8, and there were 18 total trials instead of 15. There were still 3 stimuli per trial, and the training procedure was exactly the same as experiment 1. The choice of odd was rewarded with 50% sucrose, and the choice of non-odd was punished with stevia. The results for experiment 2 is shown here. It can be interpreted the same way we interpreted the results for experiment 1. The x-axis shows the 18 trials of training, while the y-axis shows the proportion of bees that chose correctly on each trial. The chance line still remains at 0.33. From the graph we can see that despite the variability in proportion correct, they did higher than chance overall. They did significantly higher than chance, and they learned how to choose the odd category correctly. We can note that for trial 14 there's a dip in proportion chose correctly, but there's no real explanation as to why this is, and they recovered pretty fast in the following 4 trials. Overall, it appears that they did struggle more than experiment 1, and this is because the average proportion of bees that chose correctly is lower in experiment 2 than experiment 1. And this does make sense. We added complexity to the experiment by adding a third category after all. So the conclusion that I can make is that bees in experiment 1 and 2 solved the oddity discrimination problems. Yes! With 2 visual categories and 3 visual categories. And that's amazing. We can conclude that honeybees can learn relationships, and they do show some sort of relational learning, and that these results are similar to those of vertebrates, and they are the first invertebrates to show relational learning. We can continue to study relational learning in honeybees. The oddity discrimination is a simple form of same-different discrimination. There are other types of same-different discrimination experiments, and a follow-up experiment explores another type, and it's specifically called simultaneous same-different discrimination. In this type of experiment, there are 2 groups being tested, the same group and a different group. The same group would be rewarded for picking the same pair of stimuli, while the different group would be rewarded for picking the non-identical pair or the different pair. For example, in trial 1, the same group would be rewarded for picking the yellow solid pair on the left. In trial 2, they'll be rewarded for picking the blue-green pinwheel pattern pair on the right. And finally, in trial 3, it's the blue-yellow split that gets picked and rewarded. For the different group, it's the complete opposite actually. For trial 1, they would be rewarded for picking the orange-green pinwheel and the green-blue split pair on the right. For trial 2, it's the green solid and the orange-blue split on the left. And finally, in trial 3, it's the orange solid and the green-yellow pinwheel pair on the right. Thank you so much for listening to my presentation. I hope you enjoyed learning about honeybees a little bit. If you have any questions, comments, or anything, my email address is lyama23@hawaii.edu. And again, thank you so much, and have a fantastic day.